And welcome to the first ever interview episode of the Pro Peace Report. My name is Kobe. I'll be the host today, and I will be interviewing Tamar Wilson. He is an organizer for Socialist Alternative in Washington State, and he is going to be joining me now. Tamar, how are you doing today?
What's up, Kobe? How are you, man?
Nice to meet you. So tell us a little bit about yourself. When did you get into organizing with Socialist Alternative? What got you interested in it?
Sure. And let me just start off by saying thank you for having me so much on your show. I followed your work with Cory Bush's, protest on the steps, but even before that, with Force to Vote. So it's an honor to be
Oh,
talking with you here today. I first got started, volunteering for Bernie. To be honest, in both of his 2016 campaign and in his 2020 campaign. And once it looked like, his campaign was starting to sputter out, I was like, well, I'm not ready to give up fighting yet, for the things that, my community needs. So I was asking around in the Bernie world, are there any organizations that are still fighting? And I was pointed the way to Socialist Alternative, and went to an action that they were doing in support of Bernie near one of the more later primaries, and the feeling of just like impending doom was everywhere. But these people were still out here fighting. They were still in the streets talking to people about why we needed to elect Bernie in order to advance the working class. And I was like, if they're doing it when it seems like, shit's hitting the fan, then these are the people that I want to be thrown down with. So I have, signed up. And since then, it became more politically convinced that the way that the organization engages in political organizing, their strategy of organizing, and at the wins that they've been able to get, right? It's just so impressive that my allegiance has been one on that political
mhm.
level.
Yeah, for me, I had like a similar transition, like starting with the Bernie campaign in 2016. I protested outside of the Democratic National Convention in 2016
Okay.
with a group called Democracy Spring. They were trying to have open primaries, get rid of super delegates, pro democracy reforms.
Mhm.
And that was around the time where the WikiLeaks emails had dropped in 2016 when we were there. And so seeing all that happen, then Debbie Schultz resigns, then Hillary Clinton hired Debbie Schultz to her campaign like 3 days later. And I was like, like I already didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton at that point. And so then I started looking, who else is out there? What other choices do we have? And at the time it was Jill Stein was the person who I liked in the Green Party. But since then it was like I was kind of on the edge of like the Greens and
Mhm.
then taking over the Democratic Party approach, even after 2016, even after I was hurt that Bernie hadn't followed through on talking about these WikiLeaks emails and stuff like that, I still wanted him to win in
Mhm.
2020. I still had been committed to that path. But then seeing what happened in 2020 with even somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who was supposed to be one of his closest allies, kind of stab him in the back, throw him under the bus like she did, that was when to me, like there was the final nail in the coffin of, well, now, I've been a Green since 2016. Bernie was my compromise. And now I see that they're just going to go with Biden and go back into the Democratic Party. And I was like, well, no, I want to keep fighting for left change, for socialist change. I don't want to be swallowed back into the Democratic Party. And so, like, tell me what you think about like that whole approach of trying to take over the Democratic Party and pull it left. What's your perspective on that?
My perspective is right around the same time as you. I came to, Bernie was my compromise as well. And then after 2016, I was like, I'm done with the Democrats. But Bernie ran again. I was like, I felt like I could do more. So I volunteered even more for his campaign to try to, get him across the finish line. Socialist Alternative actually started a huge petition right around, near the fallout of his 2016 campaign, urging Bernie to create a new political vehicle
Oh,
for
wow.
the.
I didn't know they did that. Wow.
Yeah, and we got over 100,000 signatures, right? So there's clearly been a huge just a very small political organization was able to amass that sort of support. What could have been done if Bernie actually like you know uh showed the way forward for the working class, which is like, creating a new political party for its own interest. For me, like, I like, don't think that the Democrats can be like, the way forward for very reasons. We've seen how they are really able to manipulate the primary of their own party, right, in order to like, get the interests, to get the outcome that they want. And then even if some progressive, right, and the progressives never win really like in a very rarely win in a square, like, knockdown, drag off fight with an establishment candidate. It's typically they're catching them off guard as to how they're able to win a primary in a Democratic, to win in a Democratic primary. And, right. So barring that, like if you do somehow catch them off guard and you slip through, then there's like a whole slew of ways that the party can manipulate you, isolate you, or co-opt you once you get elected. So it's like, without a new political party that's able to combine their interests, protect one another, lobby together, just that, like, that stalwart running in the Democratic Party approach just doesn't work. Right. And, we've seen these examples with Nina Turner. We've seen these examples with um, uh, uh, like Shahid Buttar, right? We've seen these examples with and now I fear upcoming with perhaps, maybe India Walton, as like, she runs again inside the Democratic Party. And like, who, like, the candidate who she's like, running against is now going to be running an independent write-in, election against her. And it looks like, he's running a very competitive campaign, while she is relying on the Democratic Party infrastructure, right, and its party apparatus in order to, like, game her needs, rather than using that as a yoke, right, to tie all of the like problems that the Buffalonians, right, are facing, right, tying the Democratic Party, which has ruled, Buffalo for decades, right, to the vast problems with crime and, like, poverty that they're facing, right. And I think that when you do that, right, and because there's like, there's a huge interest in a independent party, right, in the third party right now. There's massive untapped potential there.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a Gallup poll I've always been citing from earlier this year, where I think it was 62% of Americans want a third party. And if you look back, that's not even a recent phenomenon. A majority of Americans have wanted a third party since at least like 2004, I think it was. And it's just that they haven't had the choice put in front of them. I think that was one of the big appeals of Bernie in 2016, was that he wasn't a Democrat. He was an independent running in the Democratic Party. And I thought that once he kind of shifted himself closer to the Democratic Party, it kind of alienated some of the people who wanted that third party. And like one of the last straws for me with the squad was, because I had thought they were going to be like what I thought Bernie was going to be in 2016. I thought the squad was trying to get into the Democratic Party to take it down the capitalist class entirely. I thought that they were going to be an oppositional left. Thought they'd be like the Joe Manchins and the Kristen Cinemas, but for the left. And now we're seeing much more so that the Kristen Cinemas and the Joe Manchins are the ones willing to step outside of the lines, maybe even threaten to join the Republican Party. But then you see AOC and the squad always defending Joe Biden and his agenda. And it's like, that to me was when I realized, and then voting for Nancy Pelosi instead of pushing for Medicare for all. I mean,
absolutely. Well, for me, voting for Nancy Pelosi should have been on the table, right? They had the numerical, like, certainty, right, in terms of, like, votes, in order to ensure that she never ascended to Speaker of the House again, right? And that should have been, like, deal number one. And then voting, like bringing a floor vote for Medicare for all should have been the deciding factor off of whoever they decided to give the speaker, vote for the speakership for. And like with all of the craven, like, ambitious people, there would have been someone, right, willing to make that vote. In terms
if there wasn't somebody, if they had 11 progressives just say, we will not vote for any Speaker of the House unless they have a floor vote on Medicare for all. There's nothing that the establishment could have done. Now, they would have probably blamed the progressives and said, oh, the reason we can't get a speaker put in place is because these progressives are being stubborn and not listening to our demands. But they could, it's not like they could get Republicans to support a Democrat Speaker of the House. It just, the math didn't work that way. I mean, Nancy Pelosi had a 30%, 35% approval rating. Medicare for all got like a 55 or 60.
It's abysmal.
So it's like the math was in their favor that they could have pushed the leverage on that. And I think that's a big reason you see them pushing now on this reconciliation bill, because it's like now they feel like this is their chance to use the leverage to make it look like they're using their leverage and their pressure. And it was because we were all criticizing them for having not done that before.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
Just to finish that off, like the reason why the squad, right, is like, voting for Iron Dome funding, why they're voting present on police militarization bills, why they're only engaging in like, very performative like actions with no follow through organizing, right? Like the sleep in at the Capitol, right? Is because they're absolutely not reliant on the working class like to get elected. They are using the Democratic Party, right? We should be pushing them to leave the Democratic Party, to root themselves fully in the movement, right? And to be pointing the way forward to a formation of a mass workers' party. That is how I view the, so criticizing them, right? There's much to criticize them over, but we need to be pushing them in a direction that's like, and to me, like constantly polarizing, like, groups, politically polarizing, like, the left around why are you not still in the Democratic Party? You do not need them to get elected. You like your fundraising is more than secure. Your vote, like, some of them have been reelected on wider margins than they were before, right? So it's no reason for them to stay in the Democratic Party other than to protect their assent in it, right?
I mean, it's like they have the platforms. AOC, if AOC were to switch to a third party, I mean, it would be front page news. The mainstream media would have to cover it. They would have no choice. It's not like when Justin Amash left the Republican Party to join the Libertarian Party. He was more of a fringe person anyway, so they weren't paying attention to him. AOC and the squad are front and center in front of everybody's attention. So if they were to do it, I don't think they would get, the population would like it. People don't like the Democratic Party. People do want a third. There's more support for a third party than there is for the Democratic Party. So it's like, I think they're worried.
They go independent and work with community leaders, labor leaders, right, movement leaders and stuff like that on calling national conferences to figure out what, like, if we were to call, all these groups, if we're going to form a new party, what are some of the default things for accountability that we will want in, right? Like for Socialist Alternative, we have Kshama Sawant in office, and she is, an independent, independent socialist. But the things that we would like, we do not see I want to be clear, we don't see Socialist Alternative as becoming the new mass party, right? We are a political organization that helps communities fight and win the things that they need. And we see a new political party as a way to get that. And there's various accountability measures that I could introduce now, or we could talk about later, that we would call for in a new party.
I mean, we could talk about that now. Before I get into some other topics about DSA, other third parties, how Socialist Alternative relates. But explain what were you saying about that?
So some of the accountability measures that we would call for is elected officials and unions, as well as political elected officials will only take the average worker's wage. Kshama Sawant, our city councilwoman in Seattle, makes $140,000 from her council salary, but she only takes $40,000 of that home, right?
Oh, wow.
That means $100,000, and then the remainder, $100,000, gets donated to movement building activities, right? Used as building strike funds, used for community support, used for other things like that to build the movement. And that's a real measure of accountability, so that these elected officials aren't getting elected and get stars in their eyes from going from a working class salary to six figures or something like that.
I mean, that's what it kind of seems like when you see people like AOC, go to the Met Gala in that tax the rich dress that costs, I don't even know, tens of thousands of dollars. They probably would say they rented it, but it's like, you don't want to see socialists get elected and suddenly be celebrities. We want them to stay socialists, stay working class, like never forget the roots of what they're supposed to be doing. And it
Well,
does
it's a
seem like they've kind of
material.
gone into the stars.
It's a material link, right? It's a show of solidarity. Like when you talk to, we do a lot of tabling in working class communities where we're just talking to working class people, like a multiracial, political organization. So we're sending, white people to black working class neighborhoods, black people to other working class neighborhoods, right? And we're talking to people about politics. And one of the most basic things that you'll hear from people, is why don't you try putting some of these politicians on the minimum wage and see how they, how fast it takes them to raise it, right? That's a bit of consciousness, right, that you can work with. And if you can show people that your political party, right, as a new workers party, right, is putting their money where their mouth is, but only the elected officials only taking the wage that everyone else is making around here, right, that's going to win you a lot of support.
Oh
Right.
yeah,
So
it'll win you
that's
support
not
for
just
people who aren't
a show,
socialists.
right? That's actually a real thing. What were you saying? I'm sorry.
I'll say that's how you'll persuade people that aren't even socialist yet. I mean, I hear people from all across the spectrum say things like they wish politicians weren't making that much. They're above us, they're elites. You even see the populist right sometimes use that type of language. And of course, they're gearing it towards a totally different political program. But it's
Yep.
because that language of anti-elite, the politicians being above us, that is a popular sentiment for people. And so I
100%.
wanted to get in a little bit to DSA,
Sure.
and so your perspective on it, Socialist Alternative's perspective on it. So we know that there's a lot of controversy on the left when it comes to DSA because they're viewed by many as being an arm of the Democratic Party because most of their elected politicians are Democrats. Now
Mhm.
in Baltimore, near where I live, they did actually have a local DSA chapter endorse a Green Party candidate for the city council, but that's
Mhm.
only a local. And the national is totally different. The national completely leaves out third parties in general in their rhetoric. And so I was wondering, because I know Kshama Sawant earlier this year joined this DSA. So I'm kind of
Mhm.
curious, like, what's your perspective? What's Socialist Alternative's perspective on that? Is it about pulling the Democratic Party left from that organization that does still do mutual aid work?
No, actually, it's not. We did receive, there was some criticism from, both sides of the left, thinking that, really misconstruing our objectives, which is to speak, right? If there's going to be a socialist movement, right, an organization that has been able to win massive wins for working class people, like Socialist Alternative, like huge taxes on the largest corporation in the world, like a $2 billion tax on Amazon to fund affordable housing, winning the $15 minimum wage here, like wins for Black Lives Matter, right? Stop the station, like all of these things, like these are lessons that we want to infuse, right, into the burgeoning and growing socialist movement. DSA is where 100,000, like or so, 90,000, mostly young people who are curious about socialist politics are going towards, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
joining this organization. So if Kshama Sawant, right, who is one of the most effective, if not the most effective legislator, I would say, right, in the country, and she's a socialist, right, getting involved in this organization and trying to not with the intention of pulling the Democrats to the left, right, but speaking to the broader socialist movement, right, helping them draw the most necessary conclusions, which is that we need our own party, right, and
Mm.
that continuing to work in the Democratic Party is going to keep butting our heads up against the wall time and time and time again. And some people would say, okay, well, we're going to sit on the sidelines and critique DSA from
Mm-hmm.
from outside and always point fingers and stuff. Others would say, and I think this is the more effective method, we're going to get involved, right? And we're going to talk
Mm-hmm.
to the masses, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in the socialist movement, these people who are and I think people have been able to pick up that there's a bifurcated right energy in DSA, meaning that there's the leadership, and then there's a
Mm-hmm.
large different large group of people interested in getting involved in a fighting movement, which is why you'll see many times people say, well, at these events there's the word DSA members there, but it may not have been endorsed. So by like, a chapter officially or something. So what we want to do
Mhm.
is, be getting in and speaking to, like, those members, and really helping them, like, engaging on a good faith comradely basis, and helping them draw, like, Marxist conclusions about the need for a new party, about the need for, like, political revolution.
And so I see here there's a comment. So if young people go toward DSA, they will not learn what true socialism is. And I think that's kind of like the reason why there is a necessity for people like Socialist Alternative to join it, to teach people what real socialism is and how it's not the Democratic Party. Because, I kind of agree with both sides here, where I understand people who don't want to join DSA at all because, they see it as corporate captured. They don't want to get involved. Some people see it as similar to, trying to take over the Democratic Party from within. They think that people are trying to take over DSA from within. But I think it's more of like what you're saying, where it's the reason you would join is because it's the largest socialist named organization in the country. So that's where you'll find the people who are most willing to listen to what socialist third parties are talking about. And so I think it's a good idea, like what you were saying, of going there, being comradely, and teaching them why we don't think this approach of taking over the Democratic Party is the right one. And so I saw you actually earlier this week. I think you shared something of a petition. I think it was to Jamal Bowman for voting for the Iron Dome funding. Do you want to talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit?
Absolutely, thank you. And this is like, incorporates, like, much larger in conversation with DSA, and like, I think a real problem with the organization and recruiting Black membership, which is that, like, they're pointing the way forward to a party that routinely sells out the Black community. So you're going to have a really difficult time. And I want to be clear that I am a DSA dual member, DSA SA dual member. So I'm not speaking on the organization in a disparaging tone, right? Or anything like that. But if you are pointing the way forward to a political party that routinely sells out the community, right, or and its own actions are what are radicalizing me, right, then you're going to have a difficult time in, like, recruiting and retaining Black cadre. But like, the petition I signed and shared was a petition to formally condemn the actions of Jamal Bowman, and then to, like, also set in stone like, precedents that if you, like, violate the tenets of the organization, its platform, then you're going to be expelled, right? And I think that's, like, and I had another tweet before when DSA sent out its own statement, like, kind of like, condemning Jamal Bowman and AOC, which they did not tag them in, right? Condemning them, which is that it's about time. Like, you need to put, like, there needs to be some actions behind these words. This is about the third or fourth time they've done this thing. Their free pass punch card has to be looking like Swiss cheese by now. Right? We need some sort of accountability, and I think that, accountability is so important, right? And that's why, like, I do agree with, like, a new political party. We would be fighting for the ability for immediate recall, where, like, the membership of the party would be able to vote and recall these elected officials who.
Well, that's similar to what we see in other countries with snap elections.
Yeah.
Countries with parliamentary systems, you don't get to necessarily be president or prime minister for the entire term. You can lose your job if the coalition government that put you there doesn't want you there anymore. They can just get rid of you and have a new election. And America doesn't have that. We only have the impeachment process, which requires breaking the law, which requires senators and congressmen determining you broke the law, and that's partisan in and of itself. So it's like,
well,
I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, we do have a recall function here in the U.S., but the way that it's used, like in the way that it's being used against Kshama Sawant right now, is basically as a tool of the ruling class, not as a feature to enhance and ensure democracy. I mean, you want to talk about laws broken, like the laws broken that they're using to sort of, like, propagate this attack on Kshama Sawant is her involvement in the Black Lives Matter movement. But the recall effort against Mayor Jenny Durkan in Seattle, who actually really did break laws by deleting thousands of text messages from during the time of last year's protest, when the cops were beating the heads in of peaceful protesters, right? That recall was rejected by the courts, while our recall was sat on by the Washington Supreme Court for 3 months in order to specifically delay the election, from being
Oh,
held
wow.
during a normal November election. So
Mm-hmm.
it's
And so what was that for? Was that because Kshama Sawant had let the protesters into City Hall? Is that what they're trying to recall her over, or was it something else?
that's partially one reason. Another is for speaking. She was invited to speak at a protest at held by family members who've had victims who've been murdered by Seattle Police Department. So she was invited to speak. She spoke there, and for opening the doors of City Hall to a protest. But essentially, what it is for using her office for doing her job, right? As what would have been said, for doing her job, standing right. Rooted in the working classes. So you can see that when you're using your office on behalf of working class people, right, you can face recall from the ruling class. But when you're using your class on behalf of big business or the ruling class with fealty to the professional managerial class, the PMC, then your recalls get thrown out, they get easily defeated in the courts, etc., like that. So
And so that's like the big difference between, the Democratic Party, Democratic Socialists, and somebody like Kshama Sawant, is that Kshama Sawant is actually being in solidarity with the movements and, bringing them into the city hall, speaking out for them constantly, every step of the way. I don't think Kshama Sawant, I never really hear about her, oh, she didn't say this for some political reasons. I mean, she seems to be very straightforward about like the working class issues, whereas we're constantly having to pull at AOC and them all and coerce them into speaking up.
part of the
And
reason
so,
is, yeah, go ahead.
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. No, I just want to say it's
No, I
because
was going to change the subject. Finish it.
she's part of she's rooted in a working class organization, right? Which is why we should be pushing the squad, right, to leave the Democratic Party so that they have no choice, right, but to stand rooted in our social movements for support. They have no choice, right, but to rely on working class fundraising and not dark pools or taking millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, and donating them to conservative Democrats to lobby for support. That's not Kshama's theory of change, and that's not how real change happens for the working class.
That's why I didn't see it as being like a sellout thing for Kshama Sawant to join DSA, because I think it is exactly that. Like, it's very clear that Kshama Sawant is not that kind of politician. And you were saying that DSA could be used as a tool to hold them accountable to
Yeah.
those socialist values. And if they don't hold to those values, maybe they get kicked out of DSA. And then that's a whole nother matter in and of itself. That's something they would have to confront. And it would definitely get
DSA would have to also get itself more rooted in the working class by I think this drive by rank and file members to hold Jamal Bowman accountable is laudable, but it's going to have to go further by really taking resolutions, right, to stand with the social movements, like taking a fighting approach to fighting for women's bodily rights, right? I didn't see really any. I think we had comrades from Social Alternative, all of our branches out at many of the marches on October 2nd. There wasn't really official DSA branches out there taking participation. They're going to have to do stuff like that, right? They're going to have to be rooted in these social movements, and fighting for demands from them, right? And not just taking an approach of electing more Democrats who aren't going to do anything about it, right? They're going to have to actually fight for that with independent candidates.
And so when it comes to the idea of forming a leftist third party, how do you think we kind of bring together the Green Party faction, the Socialist Alternative faction, the Movement for a People's Party faction, the CPUSA, PSL? How do you think we should stay in our own little bubbles for now, or how do you think at some point we coalesce that into an actual bigger third party?
That's a great question. I think it's going to take a larger are you like a more meta approach to the way that we've won a lot of our wins in our communities, a Socialist Alternative have, which is like united front organizing, and like following like a Marxist method. So what that basically means is we're going to have to work together with groups that we don't 100% agree with politically, but we could agree with them on a common enemy, right? And on common demands, right? That politically and materially benefit all members of whatever group. So you can do that. You can rally these organizations, these disparate groups on demands, and democratically decide on strategy, right? On the way forward, right? With keeping in mind the enemy that you both have, that you all have. So like, that's going to be a united front organizing method. And that's how we're going to have to move forward. It's going to like, it's going to have to be like, some sort of a democratic call, like, some sort of convention or something like that to kind of rally these. It's going to probably come out of some social movement, right, that really makes clear the danger all the groups face by just staying in their own small little pockets and sectarian battles.
That's what I worry about, is like, because I remember last election in 2020, the people who didn't trust Howie Hawkins, and so they vote PSL, or the people who vote PSL, but then, or, vice versa. And it's just like, we have so much, because we have little differences. There are little key differences between these third parties that I think are important, but I think we get so caught up on these smaller differences that we have as leftist third parties, which leaves us with 0.5% vote for this one, 0.5% vote for that one. And, it leaves us too divided to actually have that type of presence that we need to actually get it. So I'm interested to see, once we get closer to, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, when we get closer to 2022 and 2024, I do hope that there's discussions, between these different parties. Because like you were saying, Socialist Alternative is more of a local, state level, or like, it's not really trying to be the third party. It's just filling a role at the moment. And I think all of them are kind of just filling a role at the moment for different factions of the left. So someday, at some point, hopefully they can bring it all together. But I have no idea how it's going to happen yet. That's why I'm not like partisan. I'm not adamantly partisan about any one of these leftist third parties. I have things I like and dislike about all of them. I've always been a Green, just because they've been, in my mind, like the most viable third party. They have ballot access already in most of the states, or they're the only one capable of getting that ballot access at the moment. But like, that's the thing people got to think about, because if we have 5 different third parties trying to get ballot access across the country, I mean, that's difficult. Like, that takes a lot of organizing effort. Whereas if we had, a more unified leftist third party, I mean, that ballot access would be much easier to get.
This is why the squad is really doing a huge disservice, because they should be serving as the movement leaders, right? Being independent and using their offices as focal points to rally these disparate groups, right? What are the demands that we could rally around? What are the demands, right, that we can fight for? And it's not going to be just the Greens. It's not just going to be like, MPP. It's going to also take labor, right? And you're going to have to convince a lot of labor leaders to join this, like, new party. And the labor leadership, as it stands right now, is like, necrotic, ossified. Many of them are definitely allied with the Democratic Party. So the only way you're going to be able to, like, get labor is by getting new people to run for these leadership positions inside the unions, right? And drawing them to the new political party, which is going to be done on the basis of social movements, right? And stuff like that. So like, if the Democratic Party is betraying every fucking social movement, excuse my language, right?
No,
that
okay.
right, but if they're betraying every freaking one, right, then that's never going to be possible. So we really do need movement leaders to serve the role and point the way forward. The squad isn't doing that, but they could be, like, made to do it if they leave the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big problem with unions, what you're talking about there. I know my stepdad is in a union. He's like a cement truck driver. And a lot of his coworkers, they all trash the idea of a union because it doesn't represent us. It doesn't fight for us. It's a waste. Why do we even need it? We spend this money on this union and it just stabs us in the back every single time. And it's like, and that's true because a lot of unions, this is not to say, this is not an anti-union statement to
It's not
make.
anti-union.
That I say that unions are often people who are friends with the bosses or have class similarities with the bosses. And so they end up not fighting for the demands of the worst off worker.
Yeah, so the distinction we should make is that it's the union leadership, right? Because the rank and file often are like have the same material interests, right? That we are, they don't have that connection with the bosses, but they are fed the boss propaganda, right? Which like just weakens and divides them. And like I've seen it up close. Like there's been a recent Washington carpenter strike, which like the rank and file caucus invited like Kshama's help in helping them to win. Kshama and Socialist Alternatives help in helping them to like win on their strike. And the strike, the bosses had them picketing at sites that were already shut down. Like had them picketing at sites where only tools were there. Did not have them picketing at the sites where that could actually affect the boss's profits, right? And you're seeing like union leadership who see themselves as trade brokers, not labor leaders. Labor brokers, not labor leaders, right?
Yeah,
And
so like you're saying, a sit-in strike would be more effective. Something where they're actually sitting down, preventing themselves from being scabbed. Actually stopping the business from operating, not just protesting on some off their site where you can easily be ignored and replaced with another worker. And so were they scabbed in that situation when they went somewhere else? What ended up happening with that?
there were some scabs. There was because like the union leadership like injected like they were calling the rank and file first. They were calling them like misogynists and racists and like basically using the prejudices. And this is how like Marxists also stand against these things. And you have to like fight for unions to fight discrimination because they like tried to sow discriminate. They tried to sow division, right, within the rank and file, the union's leadership, right, by calling the rank and file like racist and sexist and all these s and stuff like that, and then turned around and called them like later Trump supporters and all this called them Antifa and BLM and all this other stuff. So it's like
opposites.
Yes, exactly. So,
throwing shit at the wall, seeing what sticks.
Yes, well, using all of the divisions in society, right, in order to weaken the solidarity necessary for the carpenters to get like their win, right, which would have impacted like women carpenters and gay carpenters and black, like and I talked to them. There, all of these like sorts of people are carpenters, right? So I've seen that sort of like division that the union leadership can play in dividing its own rank and file so that they can maintain their cushy relationship with the bosses, and it's sickening.
I mean, it's like almost like a microcosm of what they do to the left on a national scale. You see it on Twitter, you see it in the media. It often is the weaponization of identity politics that actually ends up hurting identity politics at the end of the day, because they're weaponizing it against Marxists, who are people who are trying to help all of the working class. And who's disproportionately impacted by all of these problems? People of color, marginalized communities. And so that's why it's so hypocritical of them to throw those types of accusations. But I wanted to shift gears to defund the police.
Sure.
Because I'm really curious to hear like how it's gone in Washington, because I know that was like one of the only places, Seattle, where you actually had some sort of policy passed where defund the police was going to happen. And I know there was some back and forth. Some people said they supported defund the police, and then they blocked it for a little while. Can you tell me like what happened there in Seattle?
So there was a resolution passed in July of 2020, a year ago, to defund the police by 50%, which is definitely a demand that Socialist Alternative has been fighting for. That in conjunction with community control over police, which is community oversight board with powers to hire, fire, investigate, subpoena, powers over budget, right, so that we can actually defund, et cetera, of police. Seattle police, Seattle City Council passed a resolution just for that 50% portion. And since then, they have been backing away from it due to police attrition over over the past year due to many reasons, and it increased crime. And I want to be clear that crime is a big is a real serious factor, right? It's something that the left has to answer and contend with so that it can win over larger sections of the working class, primarily the Black working class, who do not, right? They have no illusions that police are anti-racist, but they are also living in dangerous communities, and they have to figure out how to answer that confused consciousness of police are killing people who look like me, but I want to be safe, right? And I want to have a safe family. And that's why we would answer the critical portion to the the 50% defund is also accountability over democratic accountability over police and pointing that way forward to many working class people as a crucial factor. But to get back to it, the Democrats on city council have been reneging on their deal to cut
I've heard they're only agreeing to 20% now instead of the 50% in the most recent budget or something like that.
The most recent budget, Jenny Durkin just announced it, and I apologize, I don't know all the details on the most recent budget. I think it was just announced just a few days ago. But the Democrats, right, have been basically reneging on that deal little by little. They have so far, because we do have a Marxist, a real working class fighter on city council, we've been able to defeat a lot of the proposed advancements and behind the scenes theatricals and reallocating of money and stuff like that goes on in these smaller votes. But right now, one of the most our salient attacks on the movement is coming from Bruce Harrell, who's the Democrat for mayor. He's a Black man, and he's one of the most he's the conservative option of the Democratic Party. Allied with the police lobby, allied with the right wing really of the city. And he is against the funded police and everything like that. So we're seeing that without any real lasting organizations built from last year's protests, these sort of counter-revolutionary forces are able to attack the demands of the movement.
It almost makes you wonder, if there hadn't been a Kshama Sawant in Seattle, would you have even gotten the little bit of defund the police that you've gotten? I mean, I think her letting people into the city hall to protest, that made a big statement. Her being willing to call out constantly every time the Democrats do something like that, that makes it harder for them because, they can hide things when nobody's talking about things. But when they actually have somebody who has a media spotlight who is saying something, they can't ignore what that person is saying. And they actually have to confront the movement in that scenario. Whereas if it's just the movement saying it, we're a bunch of nobodies. It's really easy to just ignore us and brush it off, and nobody in the public will even know that it happened.
And I just want to speak on what you just said, which were fantastic points, to highlight how the left can be using electoralism to really catalyze the demands out of social movements. You'll see a lot of leftists talk about, meanwhile, in some elements and some organizations will be pointing to their success in electoralism while also demeaning electoralism for saying, oh, electoralism isn't the way forward, it's not going to do anything. But look at how many people we've gotten elected, right? But I will say that Kshama Sawant, in the way that she's been able to use her office, that we've been able to use it via Marxist organizing, really highlights how it's not going to be able to win everything that we need, right, which is a true political revolution, but how we can use social movements, how we can use our office to build social movements to actually fight the establishment, polarizing working class groups, stakeholder groups politically against the establishment, and really building movements via community level, ground level organizing, right, which any new party is going to have to do on the local level first, right, to take on the establishment and win.
That's why I'm so adamant, like, because I've always been kind of on the edge of both those camps again, where it's like, I understand why people are so alienated by electoralism, they think it's just not worth
Mhm.
it. Because, I mean, when you see people like the squad be one way and then turn out another way, when you constantly see politicians who you had promise in and you thought were actually promising, and then they end up being just like any other corporate politician, it naturally turns people off. But that's why I've always liked the third party angle, because in my experience, seeing at least the local level third party politicians that get elected, they don't end up doing that. You know, if you have an actual socialist like third party candidate who is serious about that, like they will not shift center when they get elected, because they don't have the interests of the Democratic Party pulling them that way.
Mhm.
When you're in the Democratic Party, I remember a few years ago they would like, you know, if you spoke out about another member, you wanted to primary another member because you thought they were
Mhm.
too conservative, you would lose committee spots, you would lose funding, they would smear you, the party would take you down. And so that's why they have this incentive to not do those things, even if they maybe want to. We don't know if they want to because they won't say it, you know, because they have the pressure. But if you have somebody like a Kshama Sawant, or even somebody in like Baltimore, we had Franca Mueller Paz. She got
Mhm.
like 30% of the vote, fundraised more money than the Democratic politician. The only reason the Democrat won in that race, at least what I think, from what I can tell, is he had the name recognition and he had the Democratic Party next to his name on the ballot. And so people just see the Democrat, they vote the Democrat. But she had more money, more endorsements. You know, it looked pretty clear that she was a promising upcoming leftist candidate. And so it's like, I do think more of the work should be in the streets. You know, more of the work should be organizing in the community, talking to people, doing mutual aid. Things like that are really how you actually persuade people on issues. But having that presence in a local office, but that's the thing is, how do we vet them to make sure that somebody really is serious? You know what I mean? Because people can put on a
That's a
good
great
talk, but
question.
then it's really hard to tell if they mean it.
And that's why I mean we're going to need organizers in office, right? That's what one of the reasons why Kshama is like like she's powered by a full working class organization full of Marxist organizers, socialist organizers, right? But uh, what we need is like people who are being elected from the movement, right? Not just
Mm-hmm.
people who have shown real leadership, right? And understanding that socialist leadership is not the same as like bougie leadership, which is you have all these accolades born on you for whatever reason. No, it's people who've shown sacrifice, people who've shown dedication. It's people who have shown like solidarity to the movement, to worker struggles against oppression, right? And getting these people into office, but holding them accountable via a new working class party that has like advanced accountability measures.
Mm-hmm. And I think that requires like, because we're, even when we get to that point, we have the leftist third party, we have them in office now, let's say. People also have to get out of, I think, that hero worshipping mentality where it's like, you know, we don't want to throw our person under the bus because they're the ones who are actually the good guys. You know, they're the ones who are actually on our side. We can't criticize them. I think people need to at least have some more nuance to the positions like that. So where it's
Mhm.
like, you know, no, we're not going to say, oh my gosh, Kshama Sawant is the worst thing ever. She is to the right of the Republicans. Like, you know, of course, we're not going to say it like that, but if she did do something like made a vote that Amazon liked, you know, if she did something that was clearly out of line with Marxist principles, like people have to be willing to like say that and not be worried about alienating the politician and pushing them right, or, you know, causing us to lose an election. You know, I think that's a big problem we have, like when it comes to holding the squad accountable.
You're totally right. And I mean, Socialist Alternative has like made critiques of the squad, like my personal um like Twitter. I definitely have too, but what we have to fight for is like to not make it personal, to make it political, right? Any distinctions that we make are on a political basis, based off of what we think the way forward, right, really needs to be. And if we were to come out, like, I want to be clear that Kshama is held accountable by Socialist Alternative, by measures that we would want to see, the same measures we want to see in a new party. And what that looks like is like, decisions. Kshama doesn't just make decisions, by herself,
Mhm.
right? She has, like, she's given a lot of authority to, like, do what she thinks is right, but big decisions are made in conjunction with Socialist Alternative members, right? They're made in, and then they're subject to review by the larger organization. And, like, with immediate recall being in play, like, every member, right, of the organization is able to review the decisions that are coming out of the city council, like, excuse me, not the in that manner, but, like, we're able to review the major decisions, right, that are being made to determine if that was the correct way forward or not, right? These things are open to democratic discussion and debate, and we will want that in a larger workers' party, right? We don't believe that, like, one person, is going to be a stalwart in every sense of the word, right? But if you can't just also expect that they're going to make the correct decision, right, left to their own devices, right? You're going to need to have people around them who can, like, discuss things with them, and then having those decisions up to review and discussion, right? Democratic review and discussion by the larger organization.
And that's the most important problem I see with people like the Squad and elected progressives in general, is that they're more accountable to the corporate media. They're more accountable to, the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party, to the point where, because to the Democratic Party, people like us are like untouchables. Like, people
Yeah.
like us are the ones they're not allowed to talk to us. And I think they're very well aware of the fact that if they talk to leftist third parties openly, publicly, that will lose them some degree of like political capital with the neoliberals and all the people like that. So it's like, because you see Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden say we need a strong Republican Party in this country, but then you never hear the Squad say anything relatively equivalent to that for the left. And it's like, but they're doing it. If Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden are saying that, you are allowed to say that, at least political power wise, you should use this moment to take it. But
Well, it's very
they
telling that they'll never
don't.
go on. It's very telling that they'll never go on the leftist media, independent media that they used in order to get elected after they get elected, right? That's very telling. That's very disappointing. And right, it points to the fact of how they're insulated from accountability by being part of the Democratic Party, and that's unacceptable. It's just unacceptable.
Yeah, I think a third party, at least for electoralism wise, that's definitely where I think our focus should be going forward. That's pretty much all the questions I had today. You did a really good job. We flowed through. I didn't even like look at my list of questions here because pretty much we got to all of them naturally. But thank you so much, Tamar. I've always wanted to learn more from Socialist Alternative. I mean, I've always been a big like West Coast fan in general growing up, but like it's just interesting because you know different regions of the country have different third parties and different ways of organizing these things. And I think Kshama Sawant, at least from what I can tell, is like the most effective elected local third party candidate I've seen. I don't see anybody else who's really equivalent to Kshama
Yeah.
Sawant at this
Thank
point.
you. Yeah, I think that she is the most, like, effective legislator in the country, really. And I mean, we have, like, a base out here in Seattle, but there are socialist alternative branches all over the country. So if you're watching this and you're, like, looking to join organization that helps communities organize and fight for what they need, we have branches in Philly, in Seattle, excuse me, in New York, in Boston, in Minneapolis, in Tampa, right, in LA, right, in Oakland, right. There are SA branches, like, burgeoning and starting in new cities, like, all across the country. And we're trying to like really fight for political revolution for the needs that our working class community needs. Excuse me, the things that our community class, working class community needs. And we're taking a fighting approach, and I think that's the most important thing, right? We're not standing here waiting for the Democrats to wake up or start fighting, right? To do what they said.
That's my big critique with that approach of taking over the Democratic Party from within, is that you're just becoming the Democratic Party or the next Democratic Party. You're not really taking it over and pulling it left. Like, I'm in Sweden right now studying abroad, and I see here, the Green Party only has 5% of the vote, but they're the key difference between a left government or a right government in Sweden. And that's only 5% of the population. And you see in these other countries where they have sort of coalition building after the election, you're able to actually publicly state all of your real opinions exactly as you want to say them. And then afterwards, you have to start compromising with other parties. But you don't start at that point. You know, in America, you basically start compromising after the primary. And once you've, then they pivot right after the general election. So they pivot right after the primary, then they pivot right again. Whereas somebody, even like, I liked somebody like Bernie. I liked how at least when Bernie, you know, a few years ago, not as much recently, if he disagreed with some vote, but he was compromising on it, he would at least admit, yeah, this is a bunch of, you know, corporate BS, but I have to vote for it because of the Defense of Women's Act. You know, at least he wouldn't pretend to support the worst aspects of the bill. But you see a lot of times people kind of self-censor about it. They don't want to say it. You know, the sausage is their idea. You know what I mean? It's not whatever idea they had before the negotiation process. It's not even relevant anymore. Whereas I think it should always be relevant. You should always be saying the honest Marxist opinion. And then if you have to compromise because the political system dictates it, then we discuss it at that point. But, you know, thank you so much for having me or talking to me today, Tamar. I appreciate it a lot.
I appreciate it, Kobe. Thank you for having me on. If you're interested, guys, go to socialistalternative.org. Look us up.
Perfect. Have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
Alrighty, folks. So that was the first interview I've done here for the Pro Peace Report. I want to do a lot more interviews like this, not just talking to, you know, people who are organizers for leftist third parties, but I want to talk to, you know, union members. I want to talk to people here in Sweden about how the Swedish system works. I want to talk to, you know, just people in general from around the world who are doing leftist organizing, both electorally, but also on the ground, like the real organizing work itself. And so that's kind of what you can expect from me here going forward. I'm just going to put this banner on this page. I'm a broke college student right now. I'm living in Sweden. Haven't gotten my student loans yet. Not going to get my student loans until November, it's looking like at this point. I had to get my Swedish residence permit. Then once that arrived in the mail, I had to get my Swedish personal number. It's like a social security number. Then once that got here, I have to now apply for my Swedish ID. It's going to take me 3 weeks to get the interview for that Swedish ID. Then after I get my Swedish ID, I have to open the Swedish bank account. Then I have to talk to my university to get them to put the student loans into the Swedish bank account. So I'm kind of broke at the moment. If you could donate, please donate to my Cash App. It's just ProPeace97. I'm going to give 50% of all the money I get to mutual aid organizations. Rome's Tour for the Poor is kind of the big one that I'm thinking about right now, just to start off. But I want to, as this goes on, I want to start giving to more and more mutual aid organizations, whether in the US or around the world. So thank you all so much for watching my first interview, and we'll do this again soon.